if we take the word ending conflicts through violent ways, I would say winning a conflict can be done through violent ways. But when a conflict is seemingly ended with violent means, military force, for example, the fighting might stop because someone won, but the conflict is not ended. It's still there and needs to be dealt with either by digestion, by reconciliation, or by segregation or something, but the conflict will still be there. My reply to that would be that the conflict can be won with violent means, but not ended with violent means. And it can only be ended with either complete segregation, I think only theoretical, or some sort of reconciliation in whatever way. Then the conflict is ended.
Where lust for a whole life and nothing but less makes people jump out of a comfortable pond into an unknown ocean. Welcome to that journey between the East and the West. Who says rolling stones don't gather moss? Hello everyone, I am Meenu Gupta, your host for the day, and I'm delighted to have you join me every week as amazing people share their incredible and inspiring life stories of straddling continents. Thank you. Narratives. Do you know that our lives are ruled by narratives, which we build in our heads, some of our own making, and some fed to us from the outside? Now, we can build many narratives of our own lives in different ways, each telling a different story. Yet all of it may be true and make up the total picture of our lives. Unfortunately, we and the world sometimes tend to focus on only one part of the total picture. We live in an era where the power of narratives has become, at times, a ticking time bomb in many instances. Now, why are narratives so important? Let's find out slowly as we connect the dots between the East and the West and explore the nuances of peace and destruction of war. Differences, conflicts, and wars, and commonalities too. The fact that we are all human beings, capable of the worst. Recently, I came across a terminology that for me seemed to bridge narratives of countries and of people at a deep enough level to ensure peace. And that is integrative mediation. And who best to explore the term with than Christoph, who is the managing director of CSSP, the Berlin Center for Integrative Mediation. Christoph has been involved in mediation processes in different countries across the world, including Ukraine, Nepal, Serbia, Bosnia, and several more. He previously worked for a Swiss NGO for refugees in Lausanne, the United Nations Secretariat in New York, the Research Center 700 Governance and Limited Statehood, and the Center for International Peace Operations in Berlin. He's currently also a mediator for Bosnia, which is facing its worst political crisis since the international armed conflict in that country ended in 1995. Now, there are more pieces of Bosnia's narratives that I discovered that put Bosnia at a completely different place of mediation. Thank you first for joining me, Christoph. I know that I've gone at another end that you might have expected. A very warm welcome.
Thank you, Meenu. Thank you. Great being here.
So why is conflict prevention and post-conflict peace building important enough for you that you chose it as an area of study, even in your university? Remember your days, those days, once upon a time?
Absolutely. Maybe before going to my path, just a side comment. Unfortunately, most of the work we're being asked to do or we're doing is post-conflict or when conflicts already passed to a certain degree of escalation. And just very rarely, but in some instances, we were also asked to work preventively. And if that's possible to work preventively, those are the It feels actually great. It's not easy, but it's not done enough. And it's mostly because our work is often project finances. And when there is not a conflict yet, or not a difficulty, or not a crisis yet, then rarely people invest in prevention, unfortunately. But this is just a side comment. We can go to that later. Why did I go more into working on conflicts or trying to manage, transform, or resolve conflicts? I think there are two, before studies, I would say there are two components. One, which was very conscious. I did in Germany at that time, you had to do a military service, and I chose to do a civil service instead, which was possible. And I did live in a house for migrants, refugees, that were not accompanied by their parents. So young refugees that were kids still or youngsters. And I was living with them in the same house, being young myself, just after school, before studies. And so being together in one house, most of them became somewhat friends. At least we shared a joint space. And they were telling me their stories. You were in the beginning talking about narratives. They were telling me their individual stories and their narratives, where they were coming from. And because most of them were coming from conflicting areas, from either wars or areas that where violent clashes or tensions happened or were still ongoing, that influenced me a lot. Also in the decision what to study, where to focus on. And so I think that was definitely a decisive experience, coming from Berlin, from a middle-class family, not having experienced conflicts myself really, but then being 1 year together with all these friends that had largely different experiences, that made me more curious to learn more about conflicts, how to work in conflicts, to try to transform them, to maybe even prevent them. So that was definitely one of the important moments to guide me there. Then throughout the project, throughout the studies, it somehow kept my interest in there. And then the more I work on that, the more there's maybe a second decisive factor that I learned only later on, where I'm convinced it also plays a role. Living in Germany, most of the families are asking themselves, or having also parents and grandparents from Germany, most of people ask themselves also, what did my grandparents do in the period of the Second World War, in the period where the Nazis were in power? What were they doing? What were they thinking? And actually, on the side of my grandparents, I learned when I was a youngster, a teenager, that my grandfather was actually working in the Ministry for Economy and was part of the government. I mean, he was a public servant, but he was part of the Nazi regime in that sense, not from a high political figure in the party, but still he was part of the Nazi government, of the Nazi regime. He was also in charge for business, international business, which was also largely affected by crimes from the Nazi time. And my mother was always trying to find out more what exactly he was doing, because he died in the last days of the war. And so she never had this possibility to have this exchange with him and remain curious, and also had some sort of an interest in, I don't know, leaving something better behind. Sounds a bit maybe romantic or overloaded. But I'm pretty sure that there's a little bit of this kind of family history, and maybe also this burden, or also this mission from my mother, that was an additional token to engage and to try to bring something positive to societies, to our own society, to many other communities. And I think this was not so conscious, but was definitely also part of my family history and part of what my parents gave me as a mission, and what also increased my motivation to get engaged in there. But as I said, there was not a moment where I said, this is an enlightening moment, but I think it was always there, but more not so conscious.
That makes sense, because usually these are subconscious points which add up to the final decision. And yes, it's not kind of enlightening, but all the points add up, which makes sense. And I understand living in the shadow of the post-World War period, I'm sure many families in Germany would be riddled with a lot of questions, and yet one would never know why and what of that time. I understand that. How did you come to live in that house you mentioned that you were living in a house where there were many refugees from different countries of conflicts. How did you happen to be living there?
I was basically applying for or seeking options to do a civil service not within Germany but abroad. And there is an organization that is called Civil Service International, SCI, that has volunteering programs and civil servant programs around the world. And I went through some process of the organization, some sort of selection process, and they gave me opportunities to choose between various projects that they thought were fitting to my profile and interest, that they tried to find out through a weekend of workshop and then getting to know each other. And there was on the list this house in Lausanne in Switzerland, which sounds ridiculous because it's this doing a civil service abroad from Germany. You might think you want to go really far away. But I choose this one because, I don't know, it catched my attention. It was not only a working station, but it was combining living and working in one context. So during my private time, I was living in that house. I was like a focal point supporter of the persons who were living in the house. And during weekdays, I was working in a so-called education center for refugees. So I was coming from the school. I became more or less a teacher the next day, which was weird because it was shifting perspective. I was a pupil in school. I finished school, and then immediately afterwards, I had to become a teacher in that, or a kind of a trainer, educator in this kind of center. So I was working during the week, during the day there, and then in private life, I was living in that house. I would say that 2/3 from the young refugees the young migrants were coming from the African continent, and 1/3 was fairly mixed, coming from Russia, from various Asian countries, from Colombia. And so it was a very mixed composition in the house. And I was the only one who was not a migrant, but like a social worker. I was there. I had to have an open eye and ear, not to control them, but rather to see whether there's any support, how's the dynamic in the house, what are the needs. Also to be like not a spokesperson, but for the institution to see how the living together could be improved and what could be done to support the youngsters as they were all coming by themselves without parents. So this is how I ended up in there. This is how I ended up in there. It was a list I did the choice, and because it spoke most to me, even though it was not far away, I thought I would go far away. But in the end, I turned out to have people from friends and housemates from far away under one roof.
Actually, that's very interesting that you actually became deeply involved. You got to hear the stories, people of their journeys through the conflict areas. And so that sort of makes sense. A friend of mine mentioned the other day, so I'm here going on the deep end. A friend of mine mentioned the other day that sometimes conflict can be involved or resolved in violent ways. It needs to be resolved in violent ways sometimes, which in the case of countries means military means. What is your opinion?
Well, it might sound like a nearly academic answer, but if we take the word ending conflicts through violent ways, I would say winning a conflict can be done through violent ways. But when a conflict is seemingly ended with violent means, military force, for example, the fighting might stop because someone won, but the conflict is not ended. It's still there and needs to be dealt with either by digestion, by reconciliation, or by segregation or something, but the conflict will still be there. My reply to that would be that the conflict can be won with violent means, but not ended with violent means. And it can only be ended with either complete segregation, I think only theoretical, or some sort of reconciliation in whatever way. Then the conflict is ended.
That means we are talking of arriving at a place called an understanding, like you mentioned, reconciliation
I think it's more respecting. I think that understanding is let me take the German-French example. There were several wars between France and Germany. Many of those wars were ended, but violently, but they didn't end there because the next violent escalation came afterwards. And it was only through the project of the European Union and through economic cooperation, through various efforts from both governments and societies to try to end the conflict and to reconcile. Yet I think that having been a lot in touch also with friends and families and colleagues in France, I don't think that there is a complete understanding of the other perspective, but there's a respect. There is not a sense of being in conflict anymore. There is some kind of mutual respect, but there is a limited understanding definitely, because each society still has their different perspectives on the war and their different experiences. So understanding might be some understanding of the other perspective some people have, but I would say most of people in Germany don't know or don't understand the perspective of French people on this part of the history and the other way around. Might be a critical amount of persons in France and Germany who got to know really the other perspective. I don't know if the perspectives are shared, if they actually share the same perspective, but at least they know about the other narrative. When you're talking about narratives, I would say that there are still very different narratives in there, but they're reconciled in a way that they're not being challenged anymore, or they're not part of any ongoing or sleeping or a conflict that can be reheated anytime.
I like the way you put it, actually, because you're right, understanding would be a very academic and non-useful word in this case. And reconciliation, I think, really describes reconciliation and respect. So that was really nicely put, I must say. You mentioned history. What I understand is that history is often distorted in school books to shape a narrative. And what is your experience and thought on this? Because you've worked in different parts of the globe. Because you worked also in Ukraine, which is still in a bad zone right now, in a bad place. Places far off in Nepal, and I believe Bosnia is right there, many others. Having said that, what I see and I hear constantly, and unfortunately, what I see is the young generation being fed on a steady diet on what was put there by a set of people who wanted to shape a narrative. Those people may be forgotten. The narrative is fed in, and we have a completely different picture. What do you think?
I think that because it's difficult to have actually a proof or to show the direct effect, it's difficult to quantify or the effect on history books or school education on the perception of a society or next generation growing up to in other communities, other societies. But I very much believe that a long-term reconciliation at least needs to have some sort of knowledge about the other narratives. And when we say reconciliation, I think it's to reconcile, or to be that there are several narratives that are not contesting or not fighting with each other anymore. That does not need to be necessarily exactly the same narrative. And because you were saying history or history books or schools, there's also, it's quite interesting, that brings me again to the French-German example. There was a commission of history professors from Germany and France, and for a very long time they've been struggling to write a joint history book. And the challenge was that there are different narratives, and they needed to see to what extent they can, if and how, and what kind of wording they would use to write a joint history book that pays respect to the different narratives that are there. And they actually managed to write a joint history book that exists exactly the same content in German and French, or even bilingual. They tried to do that the same with Poland, and it failed, because the societies, due to the Cold War, have been not all the time in a friendly relationship, and maybe it needs more time until the narratives can really reconcile. So there are different narratives that clash when you look at the Polish and the German history. that were too difficult to reconcile to have a similar approach, a joint history book. So this process has been more or less put on hold for now. And I guess that it's a matter of time until it's possible to write such a joint history book. And now, and this may be in terms of actual politics quite an interesting example, there have been people from Israel and Palestine who have tried the same. They said, let's look at how we could have a history book that helps a reconciliation process. And they said, we're still in conflict, a hot ongoing conflict. We cannot reconcile the different narratives. But the beginning of making a first step in there is to already know about the other narrative. And so they started a so-called bi-narrative history book in which they said they're exactly the same historic events. And on one side, there is the view from the one side, and on the other side, there's the view from the other side. So, for example, the creation of the state of Israel for the Israeli perspective is a really positive and decisive moment, which in Arabic is called the catastrophe, I think it's translated. And it's exactly the same historic event, but it's completely different perspectives on it for understandable reasons. But they said we cannot reconcile or have one history book, but trying to make a step towards the other, it's already important to know the other narrative. And I found it very courageous that they tried to have a history book that did not aim at having a joint history book, but to have showing the different narratives next to each other. And what was very interesting, they had 3 columns, one with the one narrative, one with the other, and they had a column in between, which was empty, where each one could, if they wanted to, write their own individual narrative or perspective on the very same historic event. Unfortunately, these history books remained more a project or exercise among people who are very dedicated to decrease the tensions or the dynamics of conflict, and it never made it into real classes, both not in Israel, not in Palestine either. But it shows that even depending on where in the conflict one might be, the different societies or communities might be, that the topic of history might be more, or the narratives might be more contested, more in conflict, but it's not impossible to throughout time and with the right development, to merge them into one, or to at least start a discussion about how they could be theoretically or in practice reconciled in a book.
Actually, I have example which is absolutely far off, not connected, but humor me, and I hope the audience will also. It's not blasphemous, please. You ask a couple, the man and the woman, a picture of one complete day, and each of them will have a different narrative of the same day and a different viewpoint about it. And yet they might still agree to live together in the same house. It's, if you take it at a larger level, we all live on earth. And I so loved the example that you gave of the Israel-Palestinian. That was really courageous. It takes courage to actually ask for another narrative and to accept that there is another narrative. And that already calls for an open mind. So for me, that is very important. Being aware that could be another narrative, let's hear. Whether you accept it or not is another cup of tea. That's a second level. But the first huge step is actually being open to another narrative and not saying, hey, this is what I know and this is what is true. So
that's really challenging. And I have to say that in the work, we might speak later about it, I'm usually coming as an outsider, being neither part of one or the other side. And then it's fairly not easy, but one can be a mediator or facilitator of a process, because I don't really individually associate with one or the other or one of the sides that are in conflict. Very rarely there was once a program that we were doing in Berlin, where I live and where we have the office in here. And it was among housings of refugees in an area with a very right-wing turnoff of votes. So in a context where there were quite a substantial amount of society that were opposing migration, and in general, it was in the years 15, 16, 17. And I also, having a very clear opinion on the topic, also due to my experiences and my exposure, had to sit and listen to neo-Nazis or really right-wing people. And that affected me a lot, to just listen and hear to their point of view without immediately jumping in or rejecting their perspective, and having to accept that they have their own perspective, even though I was profoundly disagreeing with. And it's easily said or done when you do this in other contexts that are not yours, but once you're affected yourself, it's so difficult to accept, or that to just listen and accept that there is another narrative when you're profoundly disagreeing with. And it's even more difficult, and this is something that I luckily never experienced, but I know from colleagues and friends, it's even more difficult when the other side, there is a narrative that delegitimizes your existence. That often happens in violent conflicts of different communities, and having to accept that there is one side who does not, or accept not only your narrative, but maybe even not your existence. That is something that I really have difficulties to understand, because I never experienced. We're going maybe a bit far in there, but I just wanted to underline how, being a mediator in a context which is not yours is already not easy. But all the insider mediators, how we call them, people who do try to work on reconciliation in a context where they're affected themselves, that's a terribly difficult work, because you will be confronted with persons and views that you profoundly reject and disagree with, and that's really tough.
But I'm glad that you brought it up. Let's go deeper there, because that is fundamental to where the world is today in different places, isn't it? Even
Absolutely.
Where we are sitting right now in Germany, there is also this now suddenly which has come up. So having said that, this is just one example, and that is literally everywhere. So let's go a little deeper, because that is what it is all about, which is really the core of it. So what happens then?
What do you mean when coming as a mediator to such a heated context, you mean?
Yeah, example that you gave, or this example, or with another one, please let's go deeper, because this is what it is all about. So how does it work? First, you are listening to opinions and views, and a completely different picture, which completely has a different value system in total of that picture from what you ever believed in and what you know. And there is another side which is completely not seen. So how would you deal with that?
Let me maybe take the example of when working with my colleagues in Kosovo. I can also later go back to the example where I was affected more myself. I'm not shying away from that, but maybe to explain the work of mediation in our organization better, I can take the example from Kosovo, because first of all, it's still an ongoing conflict, even though luckily not war or not violent on a large scale. But there, for example, we have a team of outsider and insider mediators, how we call them, so people who are not from Kosovo and not affiliated to one or the other conflict side. And we have colleagues who are from Kosovo, and they have a Kosovo-Serbian and a Kosovo-Albanian background, which means that they are coming from the two communities which are still in conflict due to the two countries, Kosovo and Serbia, being in conflict. And what we do is we try to see what kind of mediation or dialogue processes we could support. I will give you more practical examples. I just want to first explain that we have in our team, therefore, 3 different perspectives that we are trying to bring into one team. One is the complete outsider perspective of somebody who's not involved with his own narrative or biography and can be more an outsider, but may not be neutral to the context either. I find the concept of neutrality fairly difficult, but less biased or less associated to one of the group. And then we have 2 other colleagues who are, regardless how they might see the conflict themselves, immediately they're associated by people to one or the other side. And that means they're seen as belonging to one conflict group or the other, even though they might disagree with the conflicting narrative or might be engaged in reconciliation efforts. What we're trying to do is to see where do we see joint interests from different communities, but not, let's say, where we could, as outsiders, support a joint interest. Once there was a pollution on the river in Mitrovica, or the river in Mitrovica is fairly polluted. The river segregates more or less the different communities that wasn't there before the war, but the war had as an effect to more homogenize the city through which the river runs. And so we have one community more on the one side and the other community more on the other side. They all have an interest of crossing the river back and forth, doing businesses and so on, but also that the river is not as polluted, first of all, because it was creating irregular dams and increasing the possibility or the risk of flooding, but also because kids are playing there, it's their nature, it's their home, and so they have had both interests to have less pollution on the river. After the war, the one city was divided into two political entities, so two different municipalities. And I tried to use a fairly simple example, but the different political representatives, the different municipalities were not cooperating with each other because they were not recognizing each other. So there were certain shared interests. And through working first with one and the other side separately, so meaning with one municipal administration and the other, explaining who we are, it's also showing that we have among our team one of their fellow community members, that we can speak their languages, that there's a certain understanding of their narratives and perspectives, to throughout the time build some trust, to also explain that we are ready to fulfill part of their interest, for example, related to the river pollution, and that we are also ready to do that in collaboration with the other side without losing face or without forcing them to more collaboration or to some sort of maybe forced reconciliation, but only to follow their own interest, which to a certain degree is exactly the same or is in line with the interest of the other side, where they have all tons of topics that they disagree upon, where they have conflicting interests, but on the joint interest, they can actually do effective cooperation, and that it's possible. In that context, it's quite important to have, at least for us, to have colleagues from the respective communities for, first of all, building the trust to not only understand through translation, you can understand what people are saying, but only when you really have that language as a mother tongue, or really at a high professional level, you will understand the tones in between, what's being said informally, and what's said between the lines, and so on. And therefore, it's really important for us to have these insider mediators, how we call them, to really understand and be able to listen to one or the other side. And it's important to have also these outsider mediators to be able to make the bridge, meaning to be able to host or facilitate these kind of joint actions where both sides would interact. Either it's a joint action, it's an exchange, it's a political process. We also had on economic cooperation or tourism interests several programs where we realized that even though administrations or political actors or communities are in conflicts, when they live together in a certain area, there are always interests that are also shared. And in a context where oftentimes the conflict overlaps everything, it's important to show that collaboration is possible. And therefore, it's hard work and not easy to detect where are common interests and what is which ones are actually do qualify to actually work together without forcing collaboration or without taking away their right to disagree on other parts, but at the same time to start with confidence building measures, and to also build experiences that a collaboration or an exchange is possible, and oftentimes in areas where people are not even in contact, to also humanize the other, learning that it's also just a human being with just another perspective, another narrative that I might be completely disagreeing with, but when we actually clean the river together, I learned that I can get along quite well with the others, as long as we might not talk about other politics, or as long as we focus on the connecting factors. But that is a small stepstone, or that is a small piece in the puzzle to maybe later on go step further, depending in which direction the general conflict goes. But that's the work that my colleagues and I are doing, is trying in areas where conflict is still present to try to detect and make it possible to have experiences and processes of collaboration that challenge the conflicting narratives to have experiences that you can speak, work, do something together with the other side.
Thank you for sharing that example. I have then 2 questions on that. First, how do you humanize the conflict?
Through human conflict, through human contact. There was a misspelling. No, oftentimes when the conflict communities are segregated, which happens in a lot of contexts, and they don't necessarily need to be physically segregated. For example, in Bosnia, we have people living in one village, but they have the concept of 2 schools under one roof, which means that they enter the same school building, but completely different rooms or different timings. They go to different bars, they go to different institutions. The complete social life is segregated, and they might not even know they might not have talked to a person from the other community, ethnicity or religion or so on. So the more people are not in contact, the more it's possible in those conflict narratives or conflict dynamics to dehumanize someone, because you don't know someone from the other side. And when you don't know someone from the other side, you can have all kind of opinions, assumptions about the other that you cannot just prove that they're wrong, or you cannot have different experiences because you just don't have any experience with the other side, with people from the other side. And that's the dangerous part about conflicts, when you really dehumanize the other, because that's where the likelihood for violent conflict increases massively. Humanizing, let's say, the relation to the other is mostly by getting to know someone from the other side and trying to add to all the negative experiences, or maybe only assumptions, and experiences that confronts this negative assumption or experience. So to give you one example, we had, again, in Kosovo, my colleagues had a summer program in which they had sport tournaments, soccer or basketball tournaments, where they were playing in teams against each other, and there was clear rules and so on, but they never played against the other side. And with soccer and so on can be sometimes tougher with basketball, but in the end it's also a lot about fun. And when they had these tournaments, they had a day of fun and joy together, maybe also moments of confrontation. But when you see it's possible to play, also mostly fair play with the other side, it's a completely different experience than not knowing each other. Also, when you are turning out to have lunch together, that you mostly eat the same stuff, that you like the same stuff, that you can learn from the other because they're showing you some tricks. The informal times in these kind of encounters are quite important. And it's just some sort of, I would just call it not negative experience. It doesn't need to be a harmony and only positive experience, but already the more positive is, of course, the more it can challenge these kind of negative or dehumanized perspective of the other. And I think especially with youth, it's important to do that, because in many conflicts, there are generations growing up that really don't know the other side, or nobody from the other side. And just by knowing someone from the other side, people can have a different experience. And maybe next time when they're asked to challenge someone from the other side, or to attack or to bully, they might remember in the best case scenario and say, well, I don't know this person. Maybe he or she is not so bad. Or I have had the experience where I also know people from the other side who are not mean or who are not bad. So it's a lot about these personal encounters. And I think that why I was saying youth is because especially the youth is oftentimes more open they're curious to do that. And when you have the generations that went through the active conflict, they might have traumas from the conflict, they might have more reservation, and they might have their own very negative experiences. And then it might be much more difficult to organize encounters. One has to be more careful to not re-traumatize or not to cause more harm, to add new negative examples on top. So it's possible, and we have also a lot of processes with community representative or politicians from different sides. But usually that requires a very careful preparation before bringing people together, in order to make sure that, as I said, you don't re-traumatize, that you don't add to an escalation, or that you don't bring just another negative example or experience in their life regarding the other side.
Actually, that fills in the dots where we spoke earlier about different narratives, being open to another narrative. So essentially, we are filling in the dots that about humanizing being actually being exposed to another narrative. That is the whole point, being open and exposed. So there is another narrative, actually. That's it. And that is what is humanizing to make it the whole picture. I'll go further with this because I read the other day about, and this is very interesting what you mentioned in Bosnia about where they have a school and the segregation happens. They're totally, I mean, I can't even begin to imagine that, honestly, how that works in practicality. And is that escalating the situation? And because I do know that I was very surprised, I had never heard of mediation in schools, but I read that in Bosnia, mediation in schools had taken place. So, what was that? And what is this picture that you've just thrown out where you said you just threw up a picture which was very difficult, actually challenging for me to understand, walking into an institution or a building and having two different segregations? I'm just trying to picture that, honestly. I have a visual mind.
Now I would love to have my colleague Christina here. She's from Mostar and she does exactly working with schools and school mediation with pupils in Bosnia. And she would be much more competent and also shining to explain it. But I will still do my best to explain. Actually, as I said, in some areas, people are really physically segregated. As I mentioned, in Mitrovica, in Kosovo, unfortunately, there's one part of the city which has mostly one ethnicity or community, and the other side the other way around, with maybe very little differing examples or exemptions. Then in Bosnia, there's lots of, Bosnia was a very mixed society and in Yugoslav times. And when the Civil War broke out, not all villages or cities were actually absolutely segregated. And so there are still a lot of villages or areas where people live in one village. And if you come as an outsider, you go through the village or the city, and you couldn't tell, you don't know where, one community or the other lives. Not at all. There is no homogenization, there's no physical segregation, but there is, for the people who live there, there's an absolute segregation. For most of the people, there's still, in every village and city, there are people who are opposing that, who are trying to reach out to the other side, where there are some spaces of encounter, or there's still contacts to the other side. But that's rather the exception. And unfortunately, the segregation is still very present in most of the mixed villages or cities. Now, there have different education institutions regarding the different ethnicities. And so in some villages, because there's just one school building, you would not only, in some areas you have really segregated schools. So there's one school only, for example, Bosniaks, and only one for Croats, and they're completely in different schools. But in many areas, there's also the concept so-called of two schools under one roof. So they use the same building, but they either use different timings or different rooms in the school, so that there is a complete segregation. They are not mixed classes, even though they speak the same language, Bosnian. They would have different teachers. They would be completely segregated. And that, unfortunately, makes the general segregation and leaving the conflict behind. The armed conflict is a long time gone, a relatively long time gone, but the conflict is not ended. That's a good example where you said you can end a conflict with weapons. And the conflict was ended also through external actors, through some use of force, too late, unfortunately, I would say. But it was ended through force, through external force. But the conflict itself did not end. It's still living it's still there. And the segregation, the conflicting narrative, and the conflicts are still there in the Bosnian societies. And they're, of course, different in every person, every mindset. There are some who are very open, who know people from the other side, and they're against the conflict. They're even actively working against this kind of segregation and so on. But there's many who maybe are not even because they like the conflict or because they're so nationalist or racist, but just because it's a pragmatic decision to go through the daily struggle. You have your school, you have your work, you have your context, and they're mostly from one side. And it makes it quite special and also, not unique, but it's a fairly tragic development of post-war Bosnia and Herzegovina, where there's still lots of segregation, institutional segregation, and the schools are just one example. Now, talking about, you were asking about mediation, how is it possible to have mediation in there? Mediation in that context, or school mediation in Bosnia and Herzegovina, does not aim primarily or only at bringing together the different communities or different ethnicities, how some call them, but is mostly used to equip pupils with the experiences and the tools of dealing with conflicts in a constructive way, meaning not to fight them through, and to have the experience of learning that there can be other perspectives, that through either negotiation or through the support of a third side, you can come to an agreement even when you're in conflict. And most of the times, the conflicts that are being mediated in schools are not across different ethnicities, but are within one school. So if we talk about segregated schools, there are cases in which there are also conflicts or mediations going on between pupils being from one school system or the others. But mostly it's to plant the seed and to have this positive experience of dealing constructively with conflicts, and that it's possible to actually agree with the other side. And even if it's from the own community, you can also do that with people from the other community. More technically, how that works is usually you have to have principal of the school who is supportive, because usually schools are quite hierarchically organized. You always have to have also the consent or the support of the authorities. It needs also support and coaching from teachers, usually. But the idea of school mediation is that in the best case scenario, it's peer mediation, so that pupils solve disputes among themselves. And for that, usually there is a key or core group of pupils who say, I would like to act as a mediator. I would like to try to facilitate a process among people who are in conflict and try to help them to resolve conflicts or to find a mutual agreement. And that usually people are on a volunteer basis. If there are too many, one has to find a good selection process, that there's a core group of pupils who undergo some sort of training, workshop experience where they're empowered mostly, but also given some tools and training. What can a mediator do? What can you do if you have people, two or more conflicting parties, when you want to try to support them to find a mutual agreement? So this is sort of mediation training you can give to the pupil. And in the best case scenario, if there's let's say a dispute in the class, there's a bullying of one person or the other, one can go to either both sides, or one side or one person can go to the peer mediator and say, I'm really having a hard time with the other person, or this is escalating, or I really feel endangered or pressured by the other person, and can ask for the support of a peer mediator. In the best case scenario, the pupils among themselves, the mediator can be either one or several mediators, can try to bring the different pupils into Rome and to listen to have uninterrupted time of both sides to explain what their perspectives are, and try through a facilitated process to get an acceptance from the other side, and maybe even an agreement how to apologize, reconcile, or how to behave in the future, or just to accept the perspective of the other. And having had listened to that, because it's among pupils and depending also on the age, this might be quite difficult, or depending on the escalation. And that's why it's important that there are teachers or coaches who are there to additionally support the process. But in the best case scenario, you have pupils among themselves who are trained as good analytical persons who see conflicts, who are approached from people who are in conflict, and who can then solve the conflict. In Bosnia, it's not different than in other countries where it's mostly pupils having all kind of day-to-day problems. The only thing that comes on top is that the entire society, especially in mixed areas, has this huge layer of the big inter-ethnic conflict. And in some areas where you have two schools under one roof, it even becomes more, let's say, important to also be able to, when there are conflict, to mediate it among the different communities or ethnicities, because then a personal conflict might not even be personal, but might be part of the entire ethno-societal or even political conflict that is overshadowing the society.
In your experience of post-conflict, because that's where you said largely, unfortunately, it's post-conflict what is looked at, do you see a pattern in the Eastern and the Western countries?
Difference to what extent?
Do you see any kind of pattern? Because you're on the outside.
Mm-hmm.
So you are in a seat where you can take an aerial view when something comes up. Since you've handled both in the East and the West, is there a commonality or a particular pattern that you see, or there are different ways of looking or viewing?
I think that particularly on mediation, it's interesting that each society has very traditional ways how to deal with conflicts, also institutionally. In some areas, there's, village leaders, religious respective persons. In some areas, it's the women, it's the teacher who have an authority to mediate conflicts, or if it's not mediation, then maybe it's closer to arbitration, where the conflict parties are either coming or forced to come, and there's some sort of a settlement. Either it's entirely on a free will, or it might be even forced to some extent through arbitration, through institutions. But I think that every society or every different place has already some traditional ways of dealing with conflicts, and that makes it sometimes easier or more difficult to come with the concept of mediation. In some areas, it's very close already to mediation, and then it's just being called differently, and there's maybe no need to call it mediation, but they just have to be reminded on their traditional and good ways to work or to solve conflicts. And in some other areas, it might have been more close to arbitration, more related to authorities, to hierarchical decision-making. And then maybe the concept of mediation offers something that is closer to the free will and with less pressure. So in that sense, I think that it's always important when coming as an outsider or even as an insider to see what kind of experiences does the society already have with dealing with conflicts, and to what extent can that be helpful to build on or can be reactivated in terms of conflict resolution. Now, you were saying before East and West as two poles, maybe. I would say it's fairly difficult to make a huge differentiation in there. Very general, the concept of mediation is a very Anglo-Saxon one. Mediation as a terminology and as a methodology, how it's being shaped in the professional community, how it's being shaped in the professional community at the moment, is largely Western influenced, I would say. And therefore, it's not, I would say maybe it doesn't fit to all the contexts, because it comes rather from the Harvard negotiation concept. This comes from a cultural context and an approach to conflict, which is, I would say, rather Western influenced. And when you said I'm coming from outside, fairly neutral, that's where I would already have to put a question mark myself. To what extent, when I go somewhere, it's really an accepted methodology, or to what extent it's maybe not a Western concept, and maybe there are more effective, more accepted, different methodologies of dealing with conflicts or transforming conflicts than what I would understand as mediation, the methodology of mediation in per se. What I have experienced working in the former Yugoslavia or former Soviet Union area, except for Russia, I haven't worked in Russia, I have to say, but in other countries that were the previous or the former Soviet Union, I have to say that one of the differences is that women are usually playing a much stronger role in conflict resolution compared to the West. But when we look at political representation, they're not having usually key or at least not equal political representation, also not in the East. And so sometimes I would say there is a great hidden potential in the East, that you have a lot of experience and potential and competence of women being mediators and having had experiences with mediation and conflict resolution. But maybe, or not maybe, certainly underrepresented in political processes where resolving or dealing with conflicts are would be quite good. And I equally have criticism on women underrepresentation in political processes in the West. I just think that for me, it was rather a positive, let's say, experience or a very individual observation that I personally think that women in the field of mediation and dealing with conflicts in the East are much more, or throughout the past, they were much more involved and having a more prominent role, I would say. And this is a potential that is not being used enough. And this is also where in the narratives, in the competing narratives of the East and West, which are not maybe so valid for everyone, I would say this is definitely a dimension where I would say the East had a great advantage of having a much more prominent role of women in not only political positions, but also in conflict resolution, I would say.
When we are talking of these words, and you mentioned about mediation and you threw up a question, what if you explain the term negotiation, mediation, dialogue, and integrative mediation? Because these terminologies, I came across centers which are dialogue centers, and I came across centers for negotiation, then there is mediation, and now there is integrative mediation. I would just like to understand all of this.
Yes, I would try to make it hopefully rather simply, but please let me know if it was understandable. So in the end, I will start with negotiation. Negotiation is mostly known for everyone where two or more sides are directly interacting. As we're talking a lot about conflicts, if there is a conflict and you're in a conflict with someone, you can directly enter negotiations and maybe you find agreement among the different sides without any support from somebody outside. You just negotiate, you find an agreement, and it's done. That was a negotiation where you are able to negotiate between two or several involved sides without the support of a third side or additional actors. Mediation is defined as an externally facilitated negotiation. That means that at the core, you still have a negotiation among the different sides, but for whatever reason, the parties were not able to get together or were not able to come to an agreement by themselves. That's why an external person or external actor enters in order to try to support the parties to come to an agreement. What I said before, especially in the context of conflict resolution, the moment of direct negotiation between the conflicting parties, I would say, is just a very small moment in the entire process. I would say that in peace mediation, this is now a different terminology, where I would say mediation among groups in a conflict context, a lot of the work is done actually to build trust to the different parties, to understand the different interests, to understand where there are common interests, and for a longer time to prepare a direct encounter to come to this negotiation moment where the different sides are able, because through an external partners, the agenda was pre-discussed, there was trust or confidence built between the different actors. They're actually able to agree on a specific aspect, maybe not the entire conflict, but very specific aspects we're able to agree upon, and only through external support. This is mediation, where mediators or a mediation team are supporting the different sides to come to a negotiated agreement. Now, dialogue is a bit more of an open concept. Dialogue does not need to have negotiation at the core and not an agreement about a specific aspect. Dialogue can, for example, what we were talking about narratives, can just have the sake to increase the knowledge and the contact to the other person, about the other person or to the other person. So if I have people who are completely segregated, I just have maybe a dialogue about, for example, ecological pollution, or let's say, I don't know, the role of women in society, maybe a topic that is not particular part of the conflict. You can bring people together who were not in contact before. You can have a facilitated discussion or process where they enter into contact, where they can exchange their different views, but they don't necessarily need to come to an agreement. They don't necessarily have to agree on something. They don't necessarily have to implement something. Of course, a dialogue can also lead to afterwards doing something collaboratively or agreeing, but a dialogue is more open-ended or is not necessarily having the aim at coming to an agreement. But, and here comes the but, this is more academic. In the practice, you will see that some mediation processes are called dialogue. For example, the process between Kosovo and Serbia, the EU tries to mediate a process between Kosovo and Serbia, but called it the Belgrade-Pristina dialogue. Even though it's clearly an effort to try to mediate, and they just choose the wording dialogue because it was more acceptable to the other side. Because then the parties could claim, we're just talking, but we don't have to come to an agreement. While from the very beginning on, the EU was aiming to make the different parties agree to a variety of issues. So sometimes the terminology can be misleading because you always have to see what is the process actually about. And sometimes it's a mediation that is called dialogue, and sometimes it's called a dialogue, but it's a mediation.
Essentially, it would be the dialogue would be the first step. If one has to really see the process, it would be the first step where perspectives are put out in the open.
I mean, it can be first step, and then mediation can maybe follow. But for example, there's often people are saying interreligious dialogue. If you have your own religion, you believe in your religion, and you will not agree on maybe the same God or the same religion. But having interreligious dialogue means that I will learn more about I will get to know the representatives of the believers of a different religion, but there is maybe not a particular need for agreeing. So it's more a space of exchange without the necessity to agree. But maybe, talking about interreligious dialogue, maybe while being in contact, you come across certain topics where you want to make agreements on some aspects. For example, let's have once a year a joint gathering, a joint celebration. And then from a dialogue, you can come to a joint agreement. So one does not exclude the other. And oftentimes processes are rather called dialogue in order not to force people, in order to make it more acceptable to the conflict parties. And so oftentimes we would find the word dialogue that is more acceptable to the parties. We would also often find now more and more the wording mediation being used because it's got more en vogue. Some funding is connected to mediation. And so some that are in general about reconciliation, about being in contact are called mediation or peace mediation, while at the very core, there might not even be a negotiation moment. So it's very confusing to use these terminologies because they're being sometimes accidentally or sometimes on purpose being used in a different way to make them either more acceptable or to grasp more attention. And I would say it's in theory they're separated concepts, but in practice the terms are used in different ways and can be quite misleading sometimes.
And what is integrative mediation? In case I missed that.
I didn't talk at all about integrative mediation, so you didn't miss it, but thanks for hinting at that. Integrative mediation was mostly built, or it is a terminology that was used by my colleagues who founded the organization. I joined later. And I think that how we use it now changed a bit. Integrative mediation was exactly, and we can build on that, was exactly saying we don't only come to the table and try to negotiate, but integrative mediation is a mediation that aims to create moments of negotiation. But in order to get there, we need to integrate a variety of actors, either at the table or around. We need to consult a lot of actors. And we need to do a lot of actions that are not mediation. We need to do analysis and assessment. We need to build confidence. Maybe we need to do a certain research. We might need to do some fundraising or advocacy for certain aspects. So there's a huge set of activities or actions that we need to do in order to maybe at some point get to mediation among different communities. So integrative mediation tries to convey or tries to integrate a lot of different concepts that are not all mediation, but who are all aiming or trying to come to a mediation setting at some point, to come to agreements from persons or communities from different sides, and to integrate a variety of actors. Somebody would say today inclusiveness, but as we are mediators and mediators are usually in charge of the process, it's our job to integrate a variety of actors into the process, not necessarily at the negotiation table, but into the process in order to be conflict sensitive and to make sure that both the likelihood of coming to an agreement is relatively high and the agreement does not harm others and has likelihood to sustain.
That makes sense, actually. It's like building up a whole constellation to make sure that one objective which is on the table has many prongs to support it in a
Yes.
way.
So, in two sentences, integrative mediation started as a concept where, particularly from the approach, there are many different actions you undertake, not only mediation, but it's always with the aim to get to a mediation setting. And by now, I would say we changed throughout the years the understanding of integrative mediation, or we enlarged it by having more insider mediators, so to integrate more mediators from the context, and to also have a more integrative, one might also say inclusive approach in terms of actors from the context.
Sort of makes sense. Now, before I go right towards the end, can you say, maybe I'm asking an ideological statement, it's a thought. Can you separate conflict from people?
Yes, I think you can, and that's actually at the very core of not only integrative mediation but also mediation. You're trying in a process to separate what is the problem, what is the actual problem or conflict, what are the people and their individual interests, and what kind of process do they already went through, or what kind of process could be designed to support them. So to separate the people, the process, and the problem. And of course, it sounds academic, but I do think that people are connected to the conflict because in the context they are growing up. But the conflict is not necessarily attached to them without being able to get away from the conflict. There are situations where people are able to make a step back, where they're saying I disagree with large parts of the conflict narratives. And I do think that it's possible to disconnect people or persons from the conflict. It's very difficult for people who live in a conflicting context trying to do that or trying to get there because the conflict is omnipresent in their day-to-day life. But I do think the conflict came to them. They are overshadowed due to the context by the conflict. But they are not by nature a conflicting person. And that's why the more we can find moments where people can detach from the conflict or can have experiences that are maybe countering the conflict or are not overshadowed by the conflict, or where the conflict doesn't play a role in that moment, then it's possible to show that it's possible to detach the conflict and the persons. And I think that's at the core of conflict management, conflict resolution, to believe that it's not by nature or not necessarily only by context that people need to be attached or need to be connected to their conflict all the time. But there is this possibility to make the separation, even though it might sound academic or quite impossible to do. But if there are moments where it's possible, not from one moment to the other side to be freed from the conflict, but if there are moments to be freed from the conflict, then it's already a positive experience from the perspective of conflict resolution.
That makes sense. There are two ways I would put it. In a scientific way, I would say analysis and then the result coming. I have that scientific mind and I'm able to apply that in multiple settings, in intercultural settings, as well as multiple non-related in management issues also. I can take a step back, personal issues also. I can take a step back and come to a point where this is the observation, go to the analysis, why, what, and so ever, and then the resultant. Coming from another level where you say, this is the objective. Having said that, there's another angle to it. There's a scientific angle. But what I understand, the two things are married, the scientific and the philosophical. People see it differently. However, I've had the opportunity to interact with both sides in terms of science and management and at all levels. And we are talking, when we talk of it from a holistic angle, it is all about being an observer. If you separate yourself from the feeling, then the emotion, you're already becoming to a point that you are able to see a situation where conflict is taken out and the person is standing out. Then only can you come to a resolution or a reconciliation or whatever end one may take it to. But the two things, of course, need to be separated. the observation has to come into the picture. You have to come to a point where you become the observer. So it all makes sense from your angle. I wanted to hear your angle and your experience of the matter. I am adding another couple of angles to it.
Absolutely. I mean, maybe you have had your own experience where you were able to take distance from an ongoing conflict you were personally, privately, or from society in, and to take a step back and to be able to observe it a moment more from an outsider perspective. It's quite difficult to do when being in there, but there's sometimes also methodologies how to do that, or some people do it by themselves when they go, I don't know, in the nature and have a walk and take some distance from it. But maybe you've had yourself experiences where you were able to take the step back you were talking about. It sounded very much like.
Yes, we're all talking about awareness and mindfulness at the end of the day, to be able to come to a still place where you're able to observe. When we are taking it to that level, we're coming to a still place, we are able to observe the thoughts and the feelings as those. Once that separation happens from the person, then only you are in a position that the reins of the horse are in your hands. Till that time, the reins and the horse and the rider become one. And only when the separation happens can you find the direction to which you can take the horse to, in a way. So I've put it in a very different bag now.
No, it was nice hearing your description on that. Thank you.
So before we move on to our different lives, is there anything that you would like to leave behind for the audience to ponder or chew on?
I do think I want to just put a lot of admiration or respect to the insider mediators, and I don't mean necessarily only my colleagues, but there's lots of people who don't call themselves insider mediators. This is an en vogue or terminology in the peace mediation speech. But what I mean is like really involved people within their own communities where there are different conflicting parties, but trying to be an intermediary. And I find it, I only had a few experiences myself in not a war or peace context, but rather societal tensions in Germany, which you cannot compare. But this gave me just a glimpse of idea how difficult it might be when you are living in a context where there's actually a conflict. You belong to one of the conflicting parties, but you're courageous to make the steps of trying to be an intermediary, because that's the moment where people might see you as a traitor, or where you take a risk to lose the context, the support, the backup from your own people, community, sometimes family. And I got to know through my work a lot of people who are believing so much and are engaged so much in trying to have a constructive change or to be engaged in conflict resolution, but being part of the conflicting communities themselves. And I just have to say, I admire these people a lot in whatever context that they work, and it's not seen enough and not supported enough. So that's, I think, something I want to just say in general, that when there are institutions who could support more, please do that more. And if you're one of those community intermediary, try to see if somebody could support you, because that's super courageous what's being done and deserves all kind of support, whether it's from the own community, which usually is best, or also additionally from outside.
Thank you, because I think what you're talking about are people who have constructive ends as their objective, with as much compassion as they have for both sides. Then that calls for being a visionary and having an ability to do that, and at another level, having the courage to do that.
And because you were asking before about humanizing, I think that there is, in most of these people, I had the feeling there is a general confidence in humanity, in the sense that even if there are people on the other side I'm in conflict with, in the end, they're human beings, and there are at least some people that I could agree with or live with or work with. And that's this kind of, despite maybe miserable situation or super affecting conflict, to still have this belief in humanity also from the other side. This is something that I find astonishing or remarkable.
Thank you, Christoph, because we've come to where we started. In the end, we are all human beings. So that's where we had started that question, and somehow the way our conversation wrapped up, you arrived at that point. So that's wonderful.
Brought me there.
Thank you for wrapping it up like that. And thank you for being there today.
Thank you, Meenu, for the exchange and for your questions and your open ear.
Thank you for listening to the series Between the East and the West. Do subscribe to the channels mentioned on the site in case, of course, you liked what you heard. I am Meenu Gupta, the host of the series, and I'll be looking forward to your comments. We love feedback. Thank you once again. Namaste and bye-bye.